Welcome to another in Griff's Baseball Conversations. And today, a special guest is Dave Van Horne, former voice of the Montreal Expos. A lot of my viewers and listeners grew up listening to Dave, and we're going to talk about those days. There's been so much written and talked about, discussed about how the Expos left town, the circumstances around that. We're not going to touch on that because everybody knows, and there's nothing that we can smile about in that regard. So we'll go ahead with this. But before we begin, I have a disclaimer here for this conversation because I consider Dave Van Horne my best friend in baseball, going back to when I started traveling with the team in 1979, and the hours that we spent at the back of charter flights, the hours that we spent in the broadcast booth before and after games, the hours that we spent in hotel bars, the hours that we spent in bars around the various National League cities, the hours that we spent on the golf course. So yeah, that's the disclaimer. So there won't be any hard-hitting journalism here. This is just two old friends reminiscing. But I hope you enjoy, and I hope you do too, Dave. Let's go back to the roots. I mean, I remember talking to you about the early days before you got the Expos gig, broadcasting high school football off a telephone pole in Roanoke, going on and getting a AAA job with Richmond, the connection with John McHale, and then ending up in 1968 at the age of 29 years old with one of 24 major league radio jobs. Could you just, and growing up in Easton, Pennsylvania, which is, I guess, Phillies territory, but also the home of Larry Holmes, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah. And was also the home of the late National League umpire Frank Pulley.
Oh yeah, I love Frank.
Good
But
man.
the high school football days, did you ever dream of that you would become a major league broadcaster?
No. Uh, I had a great time in high school, and perhaps that was my downfall. I had a great time, but I wasn't prepared for anything. I had no idea what I wanted to do. My father was a public accountant. He would like to have seen me go to some business school and sort of move in with him. That didn't happen. I failed math every year that I took it in school, so that was not my forte, certainly. Later on, my brother, who's 6 years younger, did join him for a brief time, but then signed up in the Navy and disappeared from Easton. And so it never happened that either one of the sons took up accounting.
There's another one. There's another connection is that my dad wanted me to be an accountant, and I was at Concordia University and hated it. I was good at math, but I carried that math into baseball stats instead of into LIFO and FIFO. So yeah, we have that connection going. Talk about AAA with Richmond in the Braves organization, and then how John McHale may have reached out to see if you wanted to audition for that role.
That was, I'll try to give you the Reader's Digest version here. Uh, Before I got to Richmond, I got to Richmond right out of school, high school, because I went to Richmond Professional Institute, which you know as VCU. And I went there to study theater arts, broadcasting, radio, and television. And I stayed for 2 years and then dropped out and took a full-time job in radio. So radio in Roanoke led to me doing both high school football and high school basketball. Meanwhile, there was a fellow by the name of Frank Messer who worked in Richmond and did the Richmond Virginians games along with Frank Soden, the two Franks in Richmond. When Messer left and went to the big leagues to join the Baltimore Oriole crew, there was an opening in Richmond, and Frank Soden called me and said, "Would you like to give baseball a try? We were familiar with your basketball and football work. Would you like to give baseball a try?" And I said yes. So I moved from Roanoke to Richmond to do baseball games. And lo and behold, as soon as I got to Richmond, the owner of the Richmond Virginians moved the club to Syracuse, New York, and there was no baseball in 1965 for me to do in Richmond. But the boss had prepared me for the fact that he had been in negotiations with the Atlanta Braves, who were moving their AAA club. They were going to move it to Richmond. So the following year, 1966, the Richmond Braves took to the field, and I took to the broadcast booth along with Frank Soden, and that was my entry into baseball broadcasting.
So when the Expos got your audition tape, I assume, and hired you, had you ever been to Canada or Quebec?
Only as a youngster on some family vacations. My dad, every few years, would like to go up to the Maritimes because his parents were born in the province of New Brunswick. So before they moved to Massachusetts, where my dad was born. So as a youngster, yes, we traveled there. But I'll be very honest. I've told this story before. As soon as I got off the phone with Ray Blomquist, who had taken over as the first director of broadcasting for the Expos. As soon as I got off the phone and knew that I had that job, first thing I did was pick up the atlas to look and see where Montreal was. And after I gave myself a quick schooling on where Montreal was, I was very excited, and this was going to be a great opportunity for me. And one thing led to another, and I moved to Montreal during that first season, and hooked up, of course, with the great late Russ Taylor. And Russ and I were the first broadcasters, the English radio network to do the Expos games. And I remember John McHale telling me when he signed me to the contract, he said, "I can only give you 1 year because we don't know whether this thing's going to work here in Montreal." 32 years later, I left the Expos and went to South Florida, but that was the beginning.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about Russ Taylor. He died on his 50th birthday while still active working with you. I know it was devastating. I remember that. Russ treated me so well. He took me under his wing, even at 50. I thought 50 was really ancient, and now here we sit. Here we sit, and we're like, I'm 70, and I'm trying to do 70s proud, but 50, that's young for Russ to pass. And I know that you guys, he took you under his wing in terms of the broadcast and Montreal and travel on the road.
Yes.
He should be in the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. Let's
He
talk
should
about
he should be. He should be. He assisted, and it was a big assist in finding the location of Jerry Park to save the franchise in Montreal and get things going there. But one thing that you and I both have in common is that we both went to work for the Expos. You were a Canadian. You knew Montreal. You knew Quebec. You knew Canada. I didn't. And Russ was my teacher. Russ was the one that introduced me not only to Montreal, but to Quebec and to Canada. So I was really fortunate. And I don't think I would have been accepted nearly as well by the fans if I hadn't had Russ Taylor, a longtime Montrealer sportscaster, at my side.
Yeah, I guess knowing a little bit of the geography of the country, because that's a big part of broadcasting, especially coast to coast as the only team in Canada at that time.
Yeah.
But like your signature home run call, up and away, I know it came from a song, and I know that every broadcaster tried to get their own signature home run call, but how did that evolve for you?
Well, I was driving home. I was listening to the highlights of one of our broadcasts, and I noticed that Russ and I were very similar in our home run calls. We had a very generic, both of us, generic home run call, and I said maybe I can come up with something that's different. And while I was thinking all of this through on the drive from Jerry Park out to the West Island where we live, I had the radio on, and I heard the recording of Up and Away, Marilyn McCoo and Billy McDaniels. Or Billy Daniels. So I thought, Up and Away. I said, that's kind of interesting. That's kind of like what happens to the baseball. So I'll give that a try. So a few nights later, I gave it a try and used it only on the Expos home runs for, I don't know, maybe a week or so. And then I didn't get any reaction from it, not from Russ, not from John McHale or Jim Fanning or anybody else in the front office. And so I dropped it. I stopped using it. And John came to me one night and said, "Why aren't you using up, up, and away anymore?" I said, "Well, I didn't think anybody was really overjoyed with that call, so I thought I'd come up with something else." He said, "I want you to go back to that." He said, "I think it's unique. Nobody else does it, and it's yours." And so I went back to it that night.
The early years, and you mentioned that John McHale said, "I'm not sure how long this is going to last," but the fact that Montreal, the Royals, was a Dodgers farm team seemed to allow on televised games for you guys to get some pretty big celebrity. Yes, I mean, you had Don Drysdale, you had Jackie Robinson. There weren't a lot of TV games back then. If you look for highlights of the Expos, I think it was one game a week or maybe maximum two. But talk about the Hall of Famers that you got to meet as a young broadcaster because they were sitting next to you in the booth.
Well, next to me in the television booth, which I moved into in 1972, and got to work with the great Don Drysdale for a year. I worked with Pee Wee Reese, the captain of the Brooklyn Dodgers and a Hall of Famer. I worked with Pee Wee the next year for about 12 of our broadcasts. And then a couple of years later, why, of course, Duke, who was working as a coach, Gene Mock went to Duke and said, "I'm happy with your work as a coach, and I know you're happy with your work once a week in the broadcast booth, but he said, I need you to make a decision. Either stay with my coaching staff or go up to the broadcast booth full time." And Duke decided to go to the broadcast booth full time. And of course, we spent over 15 years together. So I had this strong connection with the old Brooklyn Dodgers with Don Drysdale, who also pitched in Montreal, Pee Wee Reese, Duke Snider, who played briefly in the minor leagues in Montreal. And listening to their stories and everything, I got caught up to date on the old Montreal Royals in a hurry with those three television broadcasters.
Yeah, I remember, we played golf with Duke sometimes, but I remember specifically going to dinner at this old Italian restaurant under the Brooklyn Bridge. And it must have been in 1979 or 80, you, me, and Duke. And he walks in there, and how many years had they been in Los Angeles? And the owners just went crazy, and they stopped playing bocce ball, and they came over and they hugged Duke, and everything was on the house. I mean, baseball among those guys, among Hall of Famers, is special. And I think it brought an aura to the Expos that otherwise would not have been there because of their profile in Major League Baseball.
No doubt about that, Rich. And the same thing happened when he introduced me to a restaurant, and I know you've been there, Il Vagabondo, up on 63rd and Park or something like that. Anyway, up there, the upper east side. And it was the same thing there. Whenever he would walk in, there were waiters and bartenders who absolutely stopped their work to go visit with Booth. Our table was always surrounded by all of the employees because they all wanted to talk to Duke and tell them how much they missed the Brooklyn team and how much they missed him.
I think we've spoken previously, you and I, about the continuity of front office and manager with the early Expos and how that helped to legitimize what was going on in Montreal. And we talk about John McHale. John McHale was the Braves president in charge of the move from Milwaukee to Atlanta, and then went to the commissioner's office and then came as president of the expansion Expos, and he brought Jim Fanning. And then Gene Mauch came in, and Gene Mauch had a reputation of working with of manufacturing runs and being able to play small ball, which this team obviously needed. But to have the same three guys at the helm through 1974, 75, through 75, how much did that play in terms of a legitimacy when you traveled to every National League city?
Well, it was huge because they were all so well respected throughout baseball, and they added legitimacy in a big way to this upstart expansion franchise in Montreal. There's one other name that never gets mentioned except by me, and I know when I mention the name, you'll remember Lou Martin. Lou Martin was picked by John McHale to leave Richmond, Virginia, where he was a general manager of the AAA club there, and go up to Montreal and be the English person who was overseeing the construction of Jarry Park on that site. So one day they were all up there for an update to see how everything was going, and they were driving home in heavy traffic about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Car was loaded. Jim Fanning was in the car. John McHale was in the car. Ray Blomquist was in the car, and Lou Martin was in the car. And John said to Ray, his director of broadcasting, he said, we've hired Russ Taylor. We need one other broadcaster for the English team. And he said, I'd like for it to be someone who has broadcast baseball. And Lou Martin spoke up and said, I can help you with that. And Ray replied and said, well, I hope so, because we've got over 200 applications. John said, I can't look at and listen to 200 applications for this. And Lou said, well, I'll save you the time. I said, get the young broadcaster out of Richmond, Dave Van Horne. And the next morning, my application and tape was on John's desk, and one thing led to another. He listened to that. He told Ray to get a hold of me. They did. Long story short, I was hired. So Lou Martin, who brought my name up in the car on that drive from Jarry Park back down to the Windsor Hotel, which was headquarters for the Expos front office people, mentioned my name, and 2-3 days later, Ray was on the phone looking for me and telling me that John wanted to meet with me in West Palm Beach, and the rest, I guess, is a 32-year history.
That was a fortunate coincidence for all of us.
Absolutely.
The talk about those 69 to 72, because in 73 there was a pseudo run for the division against the Mets, hovering around 500. But from 69 to 71, you were making silk purses out of sow's ears, because those were some bad teams in there. There was some bad baseball being played. You had Gene Mauch, you had Rusty Staub. How did you make the rest of it sing?
It was, well, of course, there are two huge names right there. I think even though the Expos were not winning, Gene got the most out of the hand that he was dealt to manage at the major league level. And as a matter of fact, when he was let go at the end of 76, yeah.
75, in the 75, he was let go and Carl Keel was brought in.
Right, 75. And in later years, John McHale would say that was one of the biggest early mistakes that he made, was losing patience with Gene Mauch. And when I say he lost patience, it wasn't so much in the way Mauch handled the team. It was more the relationship that Mauch had with the rest of the front office. Mauch, in his own mind, was not only the manager, but he was the general manager, and he picked the people he wanted brought up out of
general.
Yeah, the little general. He ran things, and that's what got him fired. It wasn't the one loss record or how he handled personnel. It was that he put himself above all of the others. And John has of course, in later years, said there's a way we could have made that all work out. And he said, I still look at it as one of the big early mistakes that we made in letting Gene go.
Yeah, Gene, when I started in 73 with the Expos as an intern running stats and writing press guide material and notes, part of the duty would be to go down to the clubhouse between games of a doubleheader and get a new lineup from Gene. And he scared the hell out of me after a loss. I would have to go down and say, Mr. Mock, do you have a lineup? And like just the glare would intimidate a 20-year-old like I was at the time.
Absolutely. He intimidated everybody. I remember on a post-game show, Russ was down in the dugout doing the post-game show, and he had Gene on. And there was some point in the game where some managerial decision came up. I think it had to do with either bunting a runner over or letting the hitter swing away or whatever the case was. And Russ asked Gene about that by prefacing his question was, some people are wondering in the sixth inning why, and then he posed the question. And Gene looked Russ right in the eye and said, what people are asking that? And Russ looked him right back in the eye and said, well, me for one. and Gene smiled and he answered the question.
Yeah, I was just getting a relationship going with Gene at the end of the 75 season because I had done specialized stats for Jim Fanning for arbitration cases. Jim hated arbitration. He hated agents. And I gave him a lot of stats before computers were there. Runners in scoring position versus left-handers versus right-handers, all sorts of stats that I kept on cue cards. And so I sent them to Gene at one point, and I said, Gene, do you like these stats? Should I send them to you this off season between 75 and 76? And first time he said, yeah, Rich, I love those stats. And then he got fired. so that was a short-lived good relationship.
Yeah. We all like Gene a lot. I developed a really good relationship with Gene. Probably people don't know this, but Gene Mock was a bridge master.
Yeah.
He was one of the country's great bridge players. And often, not every off day on the road, but if we had an off day on the road, we would get 2 or 3 bridge tables going in Gene's suite. And it was always terrific because there was no baseball talk. There was just a lot of talk about how to play bridge.
Yeah, when you're playing serious bridge, there's no time for any other conversation.
That's exactly right. And those of us that were privileged to be able to go in and play some bridge with and against Gene, it was a great experience because we saw another side of the manager.
I saw a chart. I saw an old news clipping from 1969, and in the early years, these guys weren't making millions of dollars. They weren't making hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I remember the 69 Expos payroll. There were 25 players, and 19 of them were making the minimum, of which was $19,000 at the time. So therefore, a lot of the players lived in and around the Montreal area because they had to work in the off season. And I think Charles Bronfman, who was one of the great owners that I can remember, gave some of them jobs. And there was you and a bunch of guys living in the Montreal area playing basketball games, hockey games, charity fundraisers, and working. Can you talk about that? That was before I got there. That was from 69 to 72, I guess.
Yeah. Well, at one point, and this is going to really test my fading memory, but at one point, I think there were as many as 8 Expos players living on the West Island during the off season. And you're right. There were times we played played a lot of basketball until Foley got in a fight with one of the athletic directors at one of the schools we were playing, and that ended that. But
why does that not surprise?
Leave it to Tim Foley, but that was a good time, and also a couple of times we got out. Bill Stoneman was the leader of that group, and we got out and we would go to the Kirkland Arena and play some hockey. And so it was a great chance to get together with players in the off season and for them to get to know something about Montreal winter life. And because it was far different from where most of them came from, and it was far different for me. But we made the most of it, and I had young boys at the time who played hockey. I got involved in that, so it was it was a great time out on the West Island with as many players as we had out there.
To this day, the group I miss the Montreal Expos, which is sort of spurred by Perry G and the fundraising effort for the Montreal Children's Hospital. And then around the GTA, around Toronto, people talk to me all the time about listening to radio and what it meant to them growing up. And I can tell what generation they are by they talk about Dave and Duke, or they talk about Dave and Kenny Singleton. But it's always what they grew up on, listening to radio, listening to you guys. Can you talk about maybe the similarities and differences? Because they were both great broadcasters, Duke and Kenny, and you were the commonality there. But can you talk about working with each of them and what they brought to the table?
Well, there were many similarities. Kenny he's an Oriole Hall of Famer, but he's not in the Cooperstown Hall of Fame. Duke is. They were both great storytellers and both had great retentive memories down to the detail of at bats. I think that Duke at one point could go through an entire season and 580 at bats and probably recount them all and who the pitcher was and what he was throwing to him. Their recall ability was terrific, and they both had that in common, and it made the stories so real because they had so much detail to throw into the story around the setting, from the ballpark to the pitchers to the opponents to their teammates and situations, and they both did that so well. And I think both of them in their own way did it in a very quiet way. Neither one of them were loud. They were understated, almost soft-spoken, but you listened every time they started to speak, and they always had something to say. They didn't speak just for the sake of talking. They always had meaning to everything that they contributed to the broadcast.
Yeah, there were times working with Duke, with you and Duke. He was so smooth in everything he did, on air, off air, the way he walked, the way he talked. I wanted to be like that, at some point in my young life, but it was far too late by that point. I was me.
They talked so often about how Joe DiMaggio had this majestic walk and presence about him. Duke had that. He had that in his walk, his very being, the way he was, and the way he related to people. And I was so fortunate in my career to have worked. I mean, we've already named the people that I worked with, a lot of them, but starting with Russ, and then on television, Drysdale, Pee Wee, and Duke for all those years. I was so fortunate to have them at my side because they were all terrific at what they did, and I was blessed with those partners.
You indeed were, but they were blessed with you too. So it goes both ways. I have a chronology of highlights from the early years. And there's not many. I mean, there's a lot of highlights, but I just picked some of them out, and I want an immediate reaction from you. Nothing too long, nothing too lengthy, but just your spontaneous reaction to all of these highlights. Gene Mauch, 70-70 after winning just 52 the year before.
Not surprising to me because I expected a big jump. Because of Gene and his people and his coaching staff and the scouts who went out and got some people made the team better in 70 than they were in 69.
The trade of Rusty Staub it was turned into a pretty good baseball trade, but a lot of fans didn't take it that well. It brought back uh, Tim Foley, Ken Singleton, Mike Jorgensen. So it was a good baseball. That's a third of your starting lineup. So talk about your reaction to that and what it meant.
I was really shocked because Rusty had played his way into the hearts of baseball fans from coast to coast in Canada. He traveled a lot in the off season to sell Expos baseball from one province to another. He was a terrific ambassador, and I was shocked to see him go. I agree with you about the return. The return was terrific because we needed quality people, and we got quality people in return for that. But I was shocked at the outset hearing that Rusty had been traded.
The 1973 pseudo pennant race, where at Shea Stadium they still had a chance late in September, and Tim Foley's apparent home run, got knocked down by a gust of wind in Queens at Shea, and it headed south at that point, and it didn't come close. Were you buying in? Did you think there was a chance, or were you just riding the wave?
Uh, I began really thinking that the team had a chance uh, when we projected the 1979 team at the end of 78. We knew we were heading into 1979, and I really felt that that team had a chance to win a division title and then go on to the playoffs. That was that was the first time that I really felt that in my heart, and I'd been around long enough to
Yeah.
do a little to do a little bit of scouting on my own to the personnel that we had, and watched to see how the farm system had grown uh, under Mel Didier and Jim Fanning and the others that were responsible for that, and we knew good things were coming.
So 73 was a mirage at the time. 76 spring
Yes.
training, 76 spring training, uh, or 77 spring training, and the announcement is made that the team is moving to Olympic Stadium. You were down there. What was the reaction around the team, and what was the reaction when they came up and actually saw the stadium? I think there was a parade from Jerry to the new stadium. What was your reaction to seeing an incomplete facility that really never was completed, but was seemed to be a move from Jerry to big time?
Yeah, I mean, it was a major move. I mean, Jerry was, everybody knows that it was following the team back then. Was an intimate, exciting place to be, especially during the wonderful warm summer months. Uh, Maybe not so much in April. It was windy and cold and sometimes snowy, and of course all of that weather returned late September as well. But boy, during those summer months, it was a great place to be for families in that ballpark. And taking my first look at Olympic Stadium, I thought, my goodness, they could put Jerry Park in here about four times, and it was just a monstrosity. And we all hoped for the best, but it never happened.
Yeah, you mentioned already about 79, about your feelings 79, but uh, clearly there was one, and even with the advancements in training and medical procedures, there was only one player disabled the entire 79 season. Chris Spire went on the DL for 15 days surrounding the All-Star break to take advantage of the days off. And that was it. Nobody else. Nobody else went on the DL. But talk about that leading up to Rusty's return to a pinch hit at bat in a doubleheader, and what that meant, how you were affected by the crowd reaction.
Well, we were all kind of waiting to see what kind of reaction there would be when Rusty made an appearance in the game. We were all waiting for that. And when he made that pinch hit appearance before he ever stepped into the batter's box, you could feel it in your chest. The sound was just pounding. It was such a loud ovation. And I think what the fans were saying, we've missed you since the day you left here. Welcome back. It was just incredible, the reception that he received, and then to hit the double and everything and stand at second base. And I remember post game, one of the things that I remember most was Curtis Pride saying he could feel it in his chest and in his throat. He couldn't hear the crowd react to Rusty, but he could feel it in his body, and he said it was incredible. He said it was one of the most one of the biggest reactions he had ever felt as a person who was deaf in baseball.
What? How long did you have to in the booth let that Rusty moment breathe without saying anything?
It was a while. I can't remember exactly how long we went.
It felt like it felt like 10 minutes.
Yeah, it probably was. There were a couple of times when we just felt, and I know Ken Singleton felt the same way that I did, that those moments belong to the player, not to the broadcaster. I realize that on radio as well as on television, you've got to say just enough to fill in whatever blanks there might be, but just step back and just let the moment happen and let the fans enjoy it along with the players.
We had the 79 end of season where we all had our bags packed for Atlanta, potential doubleheader if we had beat the Pirates, and then the Pirates won, and the Pirates went on to win the World Series. 80, the final weekend, and the Phillies are in town, and Mike Schmidt spoils the party, another chance to win a division, and the Phillies go on to win the World Series. And then in 81 with the split season, before we talk about the end of the split season, the strike season, you guys, you and Duke had to go during the strike, the 49 days or the 50 days of the strike, and broadcast minor league baseball. Didn't you go to Indy or Denver?
We went. We John McHale had a meeting with us. He said, "I don't want our fans to go without baseball, so I'd like you to go out to Denver and do their games. You don't have to travel with them, but just do the home schedule, the two of you. If they're off on a long road trip, you can go back home. Dave, you can go to Montreal. Duke, you can go to Southern California, to Fallbrook, but do all the home games." So we planned on that, and we went out there and did those games. Felipe Alou was the manager of the team at that time in Denver, and that was an experience, seeing the Mile High Stadium. That's where they played their games, in the football ballpark, and there was no major league team out there at the time, just the Expos AAA team. And one of the funny things that happened, Duke and I were there doing the games, and his daughter Donna was getting married. He said, "I'm going to need a day off." He said, I've got to go home for Donna's wedding, and I'll be right back. And I said, "Well, ironically, I need a day off a little bit later, because one of my sons is getting married." And he said, "Okay." He said, "On those days, we'll both just do the game by ourselves." So Duke goes home to Donna's wedding. I do the game, and the game lasted an hour and 50 minutes, and I'm done. Back to the hotel. Now it's my turn to take a day off and go back to Montreal for a wedding. Duke's working by himself. 13 innings, 13-inning game, about 3.5 to 4 hours. He's by himself in the broadcast booth. And I don't want to tell you how many beer cups he filled up in that broadcast booth, because there was no facility close by. But Duke got stuck with a 4-hour broadcast. I got out of there in less than 2 hours.
So the strike is settled, and we're playing a second half of a split season. First half winner plays second half winner. September, John McHale calls me to his suite in Philadelphia and says, "We're replacing Dick Williams. Who do you think it is?" And I gave him like 9 guesses, and they were all wrong. When you heard Jim Fanning was replacing Dick down the stretch in a winnable division, what was your initial reaction? I mean, it turned out okay. It turned out great.
Yeah, I mean, I would, like most people, I was shocked. Um, Thinking back to those times of the people that were available at the time, I think one of the baseball people that was available at that time was Yogi Berra, I think, and and he was kind of my pick.
Yeah.
I was hoping he would come over as a manager. I was surprised, and I think a lot of people were surprised when John brought Jim back the next year. And I thought, well, he's done his job and he did it well, but now it's time to prepare for the future. And of course, John stayed with Jim. Just felt he owed him something for what he did in winding up the what was it, the 80, what season was that?
Which one that that he took over?
Dick's last year.
Yeah, 81 when he got
81. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like my impression was that John gave him the job because there were a lot of young players coming up that Jim had drafted and developed, and Terry Francona being one of the major ones, and that he could deal with those guys and the veteran guys could take care of themselves. That was my impression, but I agree with you. I thought 81 was at the end of 81 it was great. 82 the reset. But we'll talk about that in a minute. But just the 81 down the stretch, the game finally in New York, winning the second half. Wallace Johnson's pinch hit triple. But I want to talk first about Donald Sutherland. To me, that's what a celebrity fan should be all about. I mean, low key background, hated to be in the spotlight, but clearly a huge, huge Expos and baseball fan. What were your impressions of Donald as a celebrity fan number one?
Just that I thought he was terrific. As a matter of fact, when we kind of had the feeling, well, we're at home, he'll be coming to this game tonight. We keep looking down at those seats down near the Expos on deck circle, and we look at those seats and they're empty, and we think, oh, well, maybe he's not coming tonight. Then we called the first pitch of the game, and we looked at, there he is. He came in. He was one of the last people to come into the ballpark and take his seat. So, yeah, he maintained a low key. Did not really want to do a lot of interviews. He was there as a fan. He was not there as the renowned actor Donald Sutherland. He was there as Donald Sutherland, a genuine Expos fan, and that's how he wanted to be treated.
And I link that to the winning that game in New York, because he came in the clubhouse and he didn't want to do interviews, and he was dragged into the clubhouse by Peter Durso, the traveling secretary. And so I thought that was pretty cool the way he handled that. But I want you to comment on that win, and then Steve Rogers winning game 1 and game 5 of the division series against Steve Carlton, and then getting to game 5 of the championship series with Ray Burris and Rogers. And I mean, that whole run seemed, like a breakthrough moment for the franchise.
It was. It's sort of capped off what had started in 79, continued in 80. And this was a really good team. I always felt for Steve Rogers being on the mound for the Rick Monday home run late in that series to win it for the Dodgers, because they wouldn't have been there without him. he was terrific, and those big wins over Carlton. One of them, he not only won on the mound, but he won with the bat. He drove in the second run in the 2-1 win over the Phillies to beat Carlton. And I always felt that he was unfairly targeted for a lot of criticism for not being able to get a really good ball player, Rick Monday, out.
Yeah, I think that that entire postseason and even the second half that the Expos were such huge underdogs in America that I just remember that we won game 5 in Philadelphia, flew to LA to open the series, and the hotel had given away all our rooms because they didn't believe that they were going to beat Steve Carlton. And then Peter Durso went crazy on the hotel guy, and the rooms were suddenly magically reappeared. But that's how little the faith there was in that Expos team.
Yeah, I think we all remember that night for two reasons. One, learning that the rooms weren't available. We had no idea where we were going to go. And number two, the most violent breakdown of a traveling secretary that the game had ever seen, when Durso just totally lost it and went berserk. And it went on and on and on. I don't know how long it actually lasted, whether it was 5 minutes or 10 minutes, but it was just terrible. The only result from that was we got rooms.
Yeah, and then the first trip in '82 when we went to the West Coast, went to LA, and we said, "Where's the hotel rep?" And he had passed away, and I turned to Peter and pointed at him. I said, "You killed him." Because of that tirade that he had got. But it was
exactly.
old. I think it was old age. I think there was natural causes.
Yes.
But to me, the 82 team may have had more pure baseball talent than 81. But you point out often that Larry Parrish was traded for Al Oliver, and the retaining of Jim Fanning to manage the 82 team. Do you feel that 82 team was as good as 79, 80, 81?
I don't think the team was as good without Larry Parrish. I thought at that particular time in history, of course, he'd been around for a few years, along with several other Expos that were really good. But Larry was the heart and soul of that team. He was the one that spoke to the team briefly down under the stands before they took to the field after the anthem and everything, and took the he was the one that always said something to charge the team up and get them ready to play. And I thought that he was at that time the leader of the team. And as good as Al Oliver was, and he was good, he was the left-handed batter, and it had been talked about for several years. One of the things the Expos needed was a left-handed bat because they're predominantly a right-hand hitting team, and they need a left-handed bat, and they got a good one. They got a good one who had a terrific year with the bat. I don't think he hit a soft out the entire season. Everything he hit was hit hard. And so he did his part, but the team was not quite the same.
Yeah, I remember. I mean, Al Oliver, I loved as a hitter, just like you. I remember he was in the batter's box looking as threatening as ever, with bat waggling a little bit, and he gets knocked on his ass by Dave LaPointe, just like right at his head is the pitch. And he falls on his back and seems to pop up like the Matrix. He just popped right back up into his stance. And the next pitch, he drills a homer to right center field. I'm going, this guy's a hitter. This guy's a player, you know? And,
yeah.
But let's move on then to the Bill Verdon years, which I've forgotten most of the details of. I mean, there's very little I want to remember about the Bill Verdon years. Pete Rose played in '84, and I think the reason that Pete Rose is married is because Bill Verdon would only allow wives on road trips so that he could bring Shirley on the road trips. And so Pete, on opening day, before going back to Montreal felt that he needed to get married in order for Carol to travel on the road with them, and that seems like a poor reason to get married, but I guess
That's Pete.
and that's Bill. I mean, and the other thing I remember about Bill, which I didn't like that much, we got off like at 1 a.m. on a flight to St. Louis to play the Cardinals. Get on the bus, it's quiet. He's sitting in the front seat with Shirley, and I'm sitting in the second seat on the bus. And the bus driver, after about 15 minutes, turns and says, "You guys from Montreal?" And clearly he's talking about the team. And Bill goes, "No, I'm from St. Louis." And I went, "You've lost me right there."
Yeah, 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 yeah.
We're in to play baseball. You are from Montreal. You're with the Expos. Just say it. But I know that you weren't a big fan of the Bill Verdon years either. Why?
Well, I remember had a good relationship with all of the managers, and I knew when I could go in the clubhouse and when I couldn't, et cetera, et cetera. And then it was Tommy Hutton and I were called in to the manager's office, and Bill Verdon said, "You guys are far too comfortable in my clubhouse. I don't want you going in the back door anymore, only the front door when the clubhouse is open to the media." And he lost me right there, and he lost Tommy right there. And going back to something we talked about earlier, remember when I said wasn't Yogi Berra available?
Yes.
I think that at the time Verdon was hired, Yogi was available.
Yeah.
And I can say this now because there's nobody to refute it, but Patty McHale told John Yogi was her choice to take over. So one half of the McHale family wanted Yogi, the other half wanted Bill Verdon.
I just remember listening to you on a radio game before I traveled, or maybe it was, oh no, I always took a Houston Cincinnati series off from traveling because it was so damn hot. And I would give that to Monique Giroux, and she would get her 6 games on the road. But it was in Houston, and Bill Verdon was sitting in the stands. He wasn't the manager yet, but he was sitting in the stands. He'd been let go by the Astros. And that was a moment where I go, uh-oh, this is going to be the next manager after Jim, because he's guesting with John McHale in the stands, and it turned out to be 100% correct. Now we'll move down the road to 1989, Mark Langston. That 89 season followed a series of sort of Buck Rogers, not mediocre seasons, but non-challenging seasons. And 89 seemed to be, with the addition of Langston, with Dennis Martinez in his prime. I think Pascual Perez, maybe Oil Can there? Anyway, it was a good rotation, a good team, and it looked like it might work. But then I think we went to New York and lost a doubleheader at Shea. And it just didn't work out. What were your thoughts? I mean, everybody in hindsight goes, that Langston deal sucked because he gave away Randy Johnson and he's in the Hall of Fame. At the time, I think we all thought it was a pretty good deal.
Yeah, the Randy Johnson that we moved in that deal was not the Randy Johnson that went to the Hall of Fame. He was on his way to establishing himself as an outstanding starting pitcher, but he was a long way from the Hall of Famer, excuse me, Randy Johnson. So yeah, we were okay with that I was anyway, when I looked at Langston's history and everything. I thought we got a really good pitcher. But then as we got used to watching Mark work, we got used to the fact that for Mark, it was all about Mark. His game was the special game. This was the game of the week. Whenever Mark Langston was sitting on it, he didn't sit in the dugout. He sat outside the dugout at the tunnel there, insisted that the bat boys have a cup of water on each side of the chair. He had all these little idiosyncrasies that he asked for, and he made himself a singular player on that Montreal team.
Yeah, while the Expos were batting, he always had a towel over his head. In that setup you're talking about, I don't think he ever saw a run scored behind him because he had the towel over his head the entire time with water on each side, sitting away from the rest of the players. It was bizarre. It was not conducive to being the best teammate in the world. And
No.
like you said, it was all about Mark Langston. Like, for instance, after he was traded and he pitched in San Diego for the first time, he asked to go home, to leave the team, go home, pack some stuff. And of course, that didn't sit well with teammates because Dennis Martinez was pitching 2 days later. He pitched a complete game. And then he asked if he could go home. So it was because I'm saying because Mark Langston did it, you know? But
Yes.
Dennis said there was a graduation or whatever it was. I don't know. But it just didn't seem, and it turned out that this was not the best, sort of the closest team that we had seen in the Expos with Mark Langston's presence there. And then he turned around and signed a free agent contract. There were moments where he could have been traded, where it became clear that he wasn't going to re-sign, where he could have been traded, and then that didn't happen. And then he became a free agent and left. But so that was sort of another disappointing end to a season. But we mentioned Dennis Martinez. I want to talk about, because a lot happened to this franchise on the West Coast. I mean, they broke a 21 game losing streak. And then Dennis Martinez and El Perfecto. And that's the classic call that isn't just Montreal, it's across Canada and across North America. It's like a signature call that people still talk about. I mean, obviously I was there. I was down in the dugout at the end of the game. But at what point did you think I need something in case he does it?
At the end of the top of the ninth inning.
Wow.
Um, I never really prepared things to say. Like every broadcaster, I had notes in front of me of this, that, and the other, but I never wrote down quotes and say, be sure to say this or be sure to say that. And I'm just thinking of I'm excited about the game situation. So was Kenny. And by the way, Kenny was the one who in the third inning turned to me during a commercial break and said, "You're going to see something special tonight. El Presidente has everything going for him, location and stuff." And he said that in the third inning and during a commercial break. Anyway,
that's giving me goosebumps right now.
Yeah. Anyway, we did see something special. So I got to thinking, and for some reason, my mind flashed back to games that I used to listen to coming out of Philadelphia when the Phillies or the A's were playing, because when I was young, they were both in Philadelphia for a while. Of course, the Phillies are still there, but the A's long gone. But one of the sponsors there was a cigar company, and El Producto.
Yeah, yeah.
And my head just went spinning. And the next thing I thought of was El Presidente. And I said, that's it. So I just shut up and waited for it to happen. And it happened.
Wow, that was such a cool moment and such a cool weekend. We flew to
Excuse
San
me.
Bless you. We flew to San Francisco right after that game, and Dennis stayed up all night with his Nicaraguan friend, a broadcaster for the Giants, and he did the Today Show with Brian Gumbel at 7:30 Eastern time, so 4:30, and I stayed up with Elliot Price, but I wasn't just talking. Elliot and I were out on the town in San Francisco, so I came back not in good enough shape to be on the air, but they hadn't asked me. I just wanted to make sure that Dennis was there, and he was there in his suit and looking great. And I went, this guy is a gamer right there. But I don't know about you, but I always relate historical moments to where I was in baseball. in baseball. Like I relate the two, and I use one to identify the other. I use the other to identify the one. Rodney King. I mean, another West Coast moment where we were supposed to go to L.A. and we were in San Diego, and the 3 games in LA were canceled. And so I'm always able to put that historical moment in perspective because we were sitting at the hotel in San Diego. I was sitting poolside drinking iced tea at 2 every afternoon, and the calls would come in from Montreal, and people would be going, "It must be hell out there." And I'd look around, I'd be at the pool in San Diego going, "Yeah, it's hell out here." But do you do the same thing? Do you have historical moments that you relate specifically to where you were in baseball?
Not so much. I really don't. As a matter of fact, and I've mentioned this to you before, a lot of times I think back to something that happened and I have to look it up. I go right to Baseball Reference and go to the year and find the game that I'm trying to remember, and then bring up the box score, and then a lot of things will come back to me, but they're not back in here. And but once I take a look at it, then I'll remember details of that day and that game. But that's the extent of it for my poor memory.
So we're winding down on the highlights that I remember because I left in '95 and you stayed until a little longer, a lot longer than that, and went to Miami and did Marlins games, and rightfully so because you were down to internet games and whatever. But the transition from Buck Rogers to Tom Runnels, who was the manager for El Perfecto, and then to Felipe. Do you, like in hindsight, just examining what Felipe meant to that struggling franchise in the mid '90s, playing great baseball, and then what he meant after the strike. Can you put that in perspective?
I think that in many ways, Felipe was probably responsible for really elevating the whole franchise. Um, Certainly on the field, his management was, for me, unquestionable. Uh, in the clubhouse, there were some minor issues, but there always are. Like most managers will say, you can never count on having all 25 players back in the day. You can't count on having all 25 on your side. You hope to have most of them, most of the key players on your side, but there are going to be people in that clubhouse that don't like the way you run the team. And I just think that it was really difficult for anybody during Felipe's time to say that he didn't have the entire club. I think he had the entire club because when the team got to see the results of his decisions, they were all good. They were all positive. There were very few negatives.
I always look at my time with the Expos and the number of coaches and players that became number of players that became coaches, and number of coaches that became major league managers, the number of front office people who became GMs with other teams. I mean, it seemed to be a proving ground, and the environment in Montreal for players, I've always said, prompted players to want to stay around the game, stay around the industry. And when you retire, it means becoming a coach. Working with a small payroll in the front office means that you have to learn how to sort of use your resources properly. And that led to GMs all over baseball. Do you see it similarly?
Yeah, I do. I see that, and I see where those that go on to manage, especially because they're the ones that have the high profile, and you can see what they're about as managers. You can see where all of them took a little bit of something from whether it was Felipe Alou or whether it was from Buck Rogers or even back early in the early years from Gene Mach. And yeah, you can see that. You can see that the Expos as a franchise had an impact on players who would choose to stay in the game after their playing days were over.
Now, we're going to end up with a couple more items here, but one is your nomination to the Hall of Fame voted by your peers. And that's important, is voted into Cooperstown by your peers. And then Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame, Graney Award, and actually in the hall itself. What do those honors say about your career and mean to you, especially the Cooperstown with the fraternity of broadcasters voting you in?
Well, needless to say, to me, it means a lot. And everybody else who has been honored with the Ford C. Frick Award has said the same thing. To be in the company of those men is really a tribute. I've always thought, for me, it's not any one game or any one season. It was the body of work. I was always proud of the body of work that I turned in over the 56 years that I did baseball, and 53 in the big leagues and 3 in the minor leagues. I don't know that I should count the minor leagues, because the first year in the minor leagues, I was learning on a daily basis, learning on the fly how to broadcast baseball games. But yeah, I'm honored to be amongst them, and it's, to me, it's still the biggest honor of my life, and I don't think that will ever change.
You know, the legacy of what the Montreal Expos meant to Major League Baseball from 1969 to 03 when they finished up there. I was talking to Gary Cohen, who was a young broadcaster when I was there, a young broadcaster with the Mets. And I saw him because the Mets were at Rogers Center for interleague game this week. And Gary said, "How's Dave Van Horne doing?" And he's doing great. And he said, "You know, we need to get Jacques Doucette into the Hall of Fame." And it struck me because he's right. I mean, Jacques was introducing baseball to an entire language, a group in Quebec. They had baseball with the Royals, but it wasn't as much of a media event as it became. And Jacques was that voice, and Jacques created French broadcasting, basically perfected it in baseball. And for Gary Cohen to remember all those years later and to say, we need to get Jacques into the Hall of Fame, really touched me. And I said, this is significant. And I knew I was going to be talking to you in a couple of days. And I thought that was great. The other thing is, we just want you to know that you're a legend. You remain a legend in Canada. And thank you for all you've done. I know you were at that final game. What did it mean to you to be in the broadcast booth, even if it was for the Marlins, at Olympic Stadium, and to wrap it up?
Well, it was a touching moment for me. I number one, appreciated the fact that they invited me into the booth. I say earlier in this interview with you, Rich, that I never really made notes, but I made a few notes there because there were some people that I said I've just got to mention as part of the history of this ball club, and I did that on that the last broadcast on the Expos, my last broadcast on the Expos radio network. So, but it was a moving time, and I've heard from so many people since then that they were listening at that time. And of course, in these days of television, you often wonder, even on radio, whether there are people out there, whether there is an audience out there. And it just confirmed to me that there's always been an audience for Expos baseball.
That's it. Thank you, Dave. The great Dave Van Horne. And Griff's Baseball Conversation will be back in a couple of weeks, and we'll have another legend. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dave. We'll talk to you later.
Thank you, Rich.